Begin the exam by assessing the temporomandibular joint. Place the tip of your index finger in front of the tragus of each ear.
And open and close your mouth.
Then ask the patient to open his mouth.
Good.
Observe the movement of the jaw, feel for swelling, and note any tenderness or crepitus. Next, inspect the neck, including the sternomastoid muscles, for symmetry, deformities, or abnormal posture.
Now let's check your neck.
Then palpate the spinous processes of the cervical spine.
And the muscles of your shoulders.
As well as the trapezius muscles
Good.
and the muscles between the scapulae. Identify any areas of tenderness. Now, test range of motion of the neck.
I'll have you
To
touch
test
your chin to
flexion,
your chest.
have the patient touch his chin to his chest.
Your chin to your right shoulder.
To check rotation, have him turn his chin toward his right
Now to
shoulder
your left shoulder.
and then his left shoulder.
Now bend your head towards your right
For
shoulder.
lateral bending, ask him to bend his head toward his right shoulder
And towards your left shoulder.
and toward his left shoulder.
And finally, tilt your head back.
For extension, ask him to tilt his head back. Note any limitations in range of motion. To evaluate the range of motion of the shoulders and related structures, assess flexion by asking the patient to raise both arms to a vertical position. Assess external rotation by having him place his hands behind his neck with his elbows out to the sides. Check internal rotation by having him place his hands behind the small of his back. If you suspect a problem, cup your hand over the patient's shoulders and feel for crepitus as the patient repeats the movements. Then inspect the anterior shoulders and shoulder girdles for symmetry, noting any atrophy, swelling, or deformity.
Now let's check the joints of your shoulder.
Palpate for tenderness at the sternoclavicular joint, the acromioclavicular joint, the subacromial area,
Any tenderness in there?
Mm-mm.
and the long head of the biceps tendon. Now assess the range of motion of the
your
patient's elbows.
I'll have you flex your
To
elbows.
test flexion and
your
extension,
hands all way
have
off
the
massage
patient bend his elbows as much as he can, and then
Extend
straighten
your
them.
arms.
To check supination and
Now bring
pronation,
your
ask the
elbows
patient to flex his
this,
elbows at
palms
90
up,
degrees and turn his
and now
palms
turn your
up
hands over.
and then down.
Let's check your left elbow now.
Next, support the patient's forearm so that the elbow is flexed to about 70 degrees.
Problems with your
Inspect and palpate the elbow, including the extensor surface of the ulna and the olecranon process. Note any nodules, swelling, or tenderness. Palpate the groove between the lateral epicondyle and the olecranon for tenderness, swelling, or thickening. Finally, press on the lateral and medial epicondyles for tenderness. Avoid pressing on the sensitive ulnar nerve.
Good. Let's check your right elbow.
As you inspect and palpate the other elbow, compare findings. Check range of motion in the patient's hands and
Take
wrists.
your hands and make a fist.
Ask the patient to make a fist,
Now open
extend
up
and spread
your
his fingers,
and
flex his
your
wrists,
Now extend them.
and extend them,
Now move your wrists
and
to
move
the
his
side.
hands laterally
And now toward the center.
and medially.
Now let's look at your hands.
Inspect the patient's hands and wrists, noting any swelling, redness, nodules, deformities, or muscular atrophy.
Now let's check each finger.
Now palpate the medial and lateral aspects of each interphalangeal joint between your thumb and index finger, noting any swelling, bogginess, bony enlargement, or tenderness.
Good.
To detect joint fluid more easily, feel for it with one hand while using the other hand to compress the joint antero-posteriorly. To detect tenderness in the metacarpophalangeal joints, squeeze the patient's hand between your thumb and fingers.
No.
Okay.
Then examine each metacarpophalangeal joint. Place your thumbs just distal to the knuckle on each side of the extensor tendon. Your fingers should be on the head of the metacarpal in the palm. Note any tenderness, swelling, or bogginess. Next, palpate each wrist joint with your thumbs on the dorsum of the wrist and your fingers beneath it. In summary, examination of the musculoskeletal system includes inspection, palpation, and range of motion tests of the head and neck, hands, wrists, elbows, shoulders and related structures, feet, ankles, knees, and hips, and spine.